Welcome to the tutorial Particle Effect Modules and Templates Part 2. So in this tutorial, I'm going to talk more about the templates and go through a few more of the default templates than I will about the particle effect modules. However, there's still 8 modules that we haven't talked about that exist in this particle effect module tab, and I think it's more important to go over these modules than it is to go through each template that exists. So I'll try to continue to integrate any module that we haven't talked about throughout this tutorial, and if I'm unable to, I'll just be sure that I go through all the remaining modules in the last tutorial. So these templates that I'm about to show you don't use anything that we haven't looked at yet, but they're interesting for other reasons, often for how they use their sprites. So let's take a look at the first one. So I'm going to go back to the top menu, select Insert, Particle, Weather, and we're going to take a look at the rain particle system. So immediately this rain module is plugged into the composite for our scene, and we can see here in the camera view that some rain is happening. So if we click on the play button, we can see what that particle system looks like. So the first thing I'd like to show you is the sprite for the system, and already you can see that there's at least 3 different drawings because we can see 3 different colored raindrops. So if we open the rain layer and we scroll down, we can see that there are 3 drawings here on the rain sprite layer. So let's bring our playhead back to here, and let's go to the drawing view. I'm just going to click on this layer again. So it's quite small. Let's turn on our grid to see how small that is, and let's zoom in. Okay, so there's our first drawing. It's transparent, it's blue. If we look at the next one, it's another shade of blue, and the third one, yet again, another shade of blue. So all it takes is these 3 drawings to create this entire particle system. So how great is that? And if we go into the perspective view and we rotate, you can see that no matter what angle we're at, these drawings are always facing us or facing the camera. So one good thing to know about all the particle systems is they're all 3D in a way, and they're all ortho-locked to the camera or to us. So you can do a full 360 and they will always be facing us, and we'll never see that kind of thin paper looking view of the drawing, which is pretty useful to have that done automatically for you. So not only is it amazing that an entire particle system can be created from just 3 drawings, and of course it's the sprite emitter that's doing that replicating, but it's also very easy to modify the particle system instantaneously. So for example, if I change the color of this first sprite to something obvious like red, and we go back to the camera view, those raindrops have been changed instantaneously. There's no heavy rendering time for any modification that you make. So let's undo that and bring it back to its original color. The last thing I wanted to show you, and this has nothing to do specifically with this particle system, but it's more for the sake of using another particle module from the particle module tab in the module library, and that module is the region composite. So let's go to the network view and let's go inside the particle system group. So the raindrops are being emitted from a planar region. And if we select that planar region, and then we go to the view menu and we select show control, and then we select the camera view and we back out, we can see this flat region from where the raindrops are being emitted from. And then if we go into the perspective view and we circle around this plane, we can see that it's actually quite narrow. So it's like a narrow rectangle. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this region and then just pull it either forward or backward so that these raindrops are being emitted from 2 different planes. And then what you could effectively do is put a drawing in between the 2 to make it look like it's raining both behind and in front. So the first thing I'm going to do now that this planar region is selected is copy it and then paste it. But already we see there's a problem here because there's only one import for a region in the emitter. So now my region composite comes into play. So let's scroll down to find it. And here it is, the region composite. We're going to drag and drop that into the network view. And then what I'm going to do is unplug this region, plug it into the composite, plug the composite into the emitter, and then plug the second region into the composite as well. And then I think I'm going to try to clean this up a bit because it's sort of difficult to see. So maybe I'll select all and then just reorganize. Okay, so one of our regions, the one that was originally there, has its own peg, but this region does not have a peg. And we don't want to copy and paste the peg because it's going to become a clone of this peg. So we really do want our own peg in this instance. So let's go back to the module library, go to the Alt tab, scroll down until we find a peg, and drag and drop it into our network view. I'm going to connect it to my second planar region. And then I'm going to connect my multi-port into that peg. So now let's take a look at where this planar region is. So let's go to View, Show, Control. And we see it's here. So already we know it needs to be flipped 90 degrees and raised upwards. So if we go to our peg, we need to enable 3D so that we have the 3 axes for the rotation. And then we're going to rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis. And then I'm going to use one of these animation tools up here, the translate tool, to bring this up. And it's hard to see in the perspective view if we're parallel or not. Oh, in fact, it looks like it's going to pass exactly over. So what I can now do is use some of my other views. So let's bring up both the top and the side views. So from the side view right now, it's easiest for me to grab this arrow and just push that plane farther in front, or farther behind actually, and then grab the vertical arrow and bring it up so it looks aligned. So for the sake of this exercise, I'm not going to worry if it's perfectly aligned or not, but maybe from the top view I will try to make them as parallel as possible. Okay, and the last thing we need to do is just put a drawing between these two planes. So I'm just going to scroll up and use a drawing layer that already exists. Let's go to the drawing view. Let's draw something really quickly. Draw a circle and fill it in with some color, maybe something green. And then let's go back to the camera view. And we can see right now that it's sitting in the middle of the frontmost planar region that's emitting the raindrops. So let's use the translate tool to push it in between the two planes. And then let's zoom in to see what that looks like in the camera view. Oh, and the last thing we need to do, of course, is to extend our drawing. So as these raindrops go across, you'll notice something. You'll notice that it looks like they all pass in front. None of them disappear behind this object. And the reason this is because if you remember, all of the z-axis movement for a particle system is done in the visualizer. If you remember me saying that you can move the entire system using a peg attached to the left port, but that the peg that can be plugged into the right port of the particle visualizer is what moves it along the z-axis. So if you think about it then, the only way that you would be able to have two systems that are staggered along the z-axis is if you had two particle visualizers and then maybe randomize them by having two particle bakers. And I will show you how to do this in a later tutorial, but I just wanted you to know this when you're trying to composite various regions, whether they be for sinks, bounce planes, or for generation planes. So there's so many things you can do with two emission regions, just not give them depth along the z-axis. But you could have them both side by side if you wanted two separate areas where your particles are being emitted from. for example. And if we look at the particle region composite, there's basically nothing to really talk about for its layer properties. So let's take a look at another particle group now. Let's look at the animated grass. So I'm just going to go back to the top, disable our rain as well as its peg, so the rain group. And I'm also going to disable this drawing layer. And then from the top menu, I'm going to insert the animated grass, and it's under the replicators submenu. So that gets plugged in right away. It's a little bit tangled here with the rain, so let's move that aside. So we have our grass and our grass peg, and we can go inside. And to see it in the camera view, let me reset the view. Oh, there we go. It's just too far down. It looks something like this. And then if we look at it in render view mode, the render looks even nicer. So let's go back to the OpenGL view. So even though this is called animated grass, the animation portion of this particle system is not coming from the action modules of the system. In this case, the particle system is really just acting as a replicator. There's no movement, there's no move particles, there's actually only one action module in the particle system composite, and that's the emitter. So all the animation isn't happening from the particles being moved as an action, but it's actually in the actual sprite of a frame-by-frame animation. So let's take a look at that sprite. If we go down here, so this is just our rain sprite. You can ignore all of this. I'm just going to collapse the rain stuff so we don't get confused. Okay, so now we're just looking at our grass sprite here. Let's take a look at that in the drawing view. So we have a single blade of grass, and as we scroll across, we can see that it's bending one way, and then it comes back and bends in the other direction. And so it's like swaying grass in the breeze. It's actually quite lovely to look at. So as I mentioned, all of that animation is actually happening in the sprite. But I just wanted to show you that this is another use for a sprite. So it's not just to have 3 separate drawings like we did with the raindrop, but we actually have a full frame-by-frame animation as a sprite. And as I mentioned before, you can also have a bitmap image as the sprite. So there are many things you can do with sprites and make a whole particle system, which would otherwise take a long time to make, out of something as simple as one emitter and 30 frames of animation. So the next particle system I wanted to look at is the bees particle system. So let's also, maybe I'll just delete this one since we don't really need it. And let's insert the bees. And maybe this time I'll get it from our particle tab so that we don't forget about that. So this one right here, the bees. I'm going to drag and drop that in. And I'm going to connect it to our composite. And we can see it here. They actually look like bees. So this is one of the most simple examples, and if we go into the bees group, we can see once again we really only have one action, and that's a sprite emitter, a sprite, and the 3D region where it's being generated from, but other than that it's quite a simple setup as well. So it's really just an animated drawing layer that's been replicated in space until it forms a stable system. So in other words, that at its max no new particles are being created, and that the particles that are there are just animating infinitely. So once again, let's look at the sprite for this group here. And you can even see that a peg has been added in the topmost layer, if you remember. And that's where we see this interpolated animation. So let's break down the animation. The first animation isn't the fact that this whole system's moving, it's this frame-by-frame animation. And if we go to the drawing view, we'll be able to see that. So I'm going to reset my view. I might back out even further. And we see here's a little bee. And if we scroll across, here he is again, here he is again, here he is again. And we see him basically just buzzing around in a counterclockwise motion for what looks like 8 frames. So something like that can be taken and made into something like this. So let's take a look how by analyzing the system. So firstly, in the sprite emitter, we can see that there's 5 of those bees that are produced per frame, and there's a 100% chance that they will be produced. We also see that the type generation strategy is randomly assigning type numbers. So our types 1 to 8 are randomly assigned. And what that means is that in that cycle, any of these 5 bees that are being generated per frame can start anywhere in that cycle. They may not start at frame 1. They might start at frame 6, for example, and then continue around in that circular motion. So the age at birth is 5. So already on top of that random assigning, they're already 5 years old. So they're already part way through their cycle. And then if we go into the rendering tab, we can see that they're cycling at a normal cycle and that their rendering strategy has to do with their age. So then if we look in the baker, we can see that the number of pre-roll frames is 50, which means that if there's 5 bees being generated per frame, but we're already at 50 when we start our animation at the beginning of this scene, that means that 5 times 50 is 250, but our maximum number of particles is 150, which means that when we start our animation, we're already at the maximum number of particles that we're going to have ever. So that means that this is a stable system. No new particles are going to be made and none are going to disappear. None of them are going to be killed. On top of that, they're being randomly generated as to where their location is, and that's why we have them sort of all over the place. And it's hard to tell, but they all are going in that counterclockwise circle all over the place here as they're moving across. In addition to this, the reason that we sort of have what seems like a circular center, it seems like they're all sort of swarming around each other. They seem sort of dense in the middle and a little bit loose around the edge is because of the region that they are being emitted from. So if we select the 3D region in the network view and then we do our show controls, which happens to be Command F11 on Mac, we see that there's actually a sphere here, and that's where these bees are being emitted from. So if we look in the perspective view and we spin this around, we can see now why we get that feeling that they're in a 3D sphere, because they essentially are. That's how they're being emitted. So let's hide all those controls. So that's essentially all it takes to make this sort of randomized system of bees from a single drawing that's been cycled and a single sprite emitter. In addition to this, the reason that we're able to see the system move from right to left is because of the peg that's hooked into the left side of the particle visualizer, but we see that it disappears into the multi-port in, and then if we go to the top, we realize it's this peg here. So because it's plugged into the visualizer, it's able to move the entire system from right to left. Okay, so now let's take a look at our next example. So once again, I'm going to delete these bees because we didn't make any modifications to them. Let's delete them. Say okay. And the next example I'd like to add are the lemmings example. So let's go to our module library. And we see our lemmings here. So I'm going to drag and drop this into the network view. And then I'm going to plug it into my composite once more, and it appears here in the camera view. So this was inspired from a video game from the 1990s. And if we play it, we can see that it's a bunch of little characters. I'll zoom in so you can actually see that they're characters that are dropping down, hitting this log, walking to the edge of the log, falling off the log, switching direction from which they're facing because they're walking off this way, but they flip and then they land on this bounce plane that happens to be angled. And they switch direction, then continue walking until they fall off the log and hit the ground. Those particles that hit the log and start facing this way walk off the log in this direction, drop right to the ground, and walk right off the screen. So that's essentially what's going on here, and you can play that several times to get a sense of that. So it's a pretty fun example, and it incorporates a lot of things. We have bounce planes, we take advantage of the flip drawing concept, we have gravity, we have an animated sprite. So let's take a look at all of those things and see what makes this scene happen. So if we open up our lemming scene and we open up once again the lemming particles group and we move down And we come down here to the lemming. So that's our character. And we go to the drawing view. Let's take a look at what this little guy looks like. So it kind of looks like this punk guy with this, cobalt blue tank top and some green hair. And he's really just a simple 4-frame walk cycle if you think about it. His legs change. You can tell there's a darker gray in the back and a light gray for his pants, and his arm moves in accordance with his steps. But that's really all it is. It gets cycled, it seems like, until 45 frames. Okay, so now let's take a look inside the lemming scene. So we actually have several groups inside this one group. We have the lemmings particle group, the background, which has also been grouped, and the gradient background. So let's go back to the camera view. So that's the sky probably. And there's an actual regular composite inside the group as well. So what we're looking to examine is a lemmings particle group here. So let's go inside that. And once again, there's nothing in here that we haven't seen before. We have velocity, gravity, move particles. We have our emitter coming from a 3D region. We have our wind friction. And once again, these are other background elements that I believe correspond to the bounce planes. So let's take a look inside one of those. I'm going to go into the central block here. And as you can see, there's a peg, a planar region, and then our bounce action. And that bounce comes out of the multiport out. And if we go back into the lemmings particle group, we can see that it actually plugs into the particle system composite like all the other actions. So we'll go back inside just for a minute once more. We'll take a look at our planar region. So there it is. So it's trying to align itself with the drawing. It's obviously perpendicular to the drawing, so the lemmings hit this bounce plane, and then they make the decision to go one way or the other. And of course, all of this is controlled in the emitter. So if we go back to the lemmings particle group, and we go inside the emitter, we look at its layer properties. At the rendering tab, we can see here that says flip x-axis to match direction, and that's why that flipping occurs as soon as the lemmings hit this bounce plane. Okay, so the last example I'd like to show you are the fairies. So let's delete this lemming scene. And then from the top menu, let's go back to Insert, Particles, and it's under Effects, and it's not fairy singular, but it's fairies plural. Let's go into that group. And I think I actually have to scroll the playhead across for you to see anything. So there are fairies. And the point of this particle system is how you make a particle system within a particle system. So each of these fairies are a particle, but they themselves shed all these twinkling little stars or fairy dust or whatever you would call it. And so that's another particle system. So the purpose of this is to show you that neat particle and particle effect. And this is, of course, an advanced example, which will also give me an opportunity to go into the sprite emitter. If you remember, there was an advanced section that I didn't go into at all, but we can use it in this case of the fairies. So let me back out a bit here. Let's try to decipher what's going on in this system. So already we can see that we have two sprite emitters, two bakers, two visualizers. So we have the idea that there are basically two systems being set up here, two particle system composites as well. And that what's being plugged into the right port of the second sprite emitter is pretty much this entire first system. So our first sprite emitter is what has the fairies. We know this because it says fairy sprite. So if we click on that and we go in the drawing view, we go back to the first frame, we see that it's this fairy that looks like it's been squashed and stretched a little bit to make it look like it's flying. And it's being emitted from a 3D region. So if we go back to the camera view, let's scroll forward a bit. I might even back out a bit so we can see where these fairies enter in. So they enter in off screen. They seem like they're being generated over here, and then they're coming into camera view. So their generator's probably somewhere over here. So if we go to view, show controls with the 3D region selected, we can see that it's this cube over here. So they're plugged into the sprite emitter, and we'll take a look at what those properties show, which is a pretty general stuff, so only one is generated per frame, with only the probability of 25% of it even being generated, so there might be a little bit of a lag between when each fairy is created. For the rendering, we're using their age, they're being cycled, there's 6 drawings in that cycle, etc., etc., using the drawing color. So that's what's going on in the sprite emitter for this fairy. So we have that initial velocity to push them forward, and that's what makes them move across, and they disappear into a sink. So let's take a look at what that looks like, and it looks like both these fairies and their sparkles disappear into what appears to be the same sink. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, so the sink is massive. Could even go into the perspective view and back out a bit. So the sink looks like it's almost taking up the size of an entire room here. So it looks like it expands just outside of the camera frame. So once they're in here, we can see them, but once they've exited outside of this region, they disappear. So I'm actually going to hide all controls. It's kind of difficult to look at, and we'll go back to the camera view. So then these 3 actions are composited, put through the particle baker, which is then plugged into the second sprite emitter. So in the baker, we can see that the maximum number of particles is 3. So once those 3 fairies have been generated, they're not going to make any more. So that's why we only see 3 fairies. And then if we go into the second sprite emitter, well, actually it's drawing. We can take a look at the sparkle drawing. Let's go back to frame 1 to see it. It's really quite faded. Try to zoom in as much as possible here. Maybe if I put that grid underneath, you'll be able to see it a bit more. So that's the star, and it's here in drawing 1. So we take all the information from the system, from the particle baker, but we don't plug the particle visualizer into the sprite emitter because that would flatten everything that we see here. So the reason that we're plugging in this entire system into the right port of the sprite emitter is because that's the place we normally put the region. So our region this time is obviously the fairies, so that's why we put in this entire system. And we put them in before the particle visualizer, as I said, because once they're flattened, it would take them as one region, but if we're taking the entire system into account before they've been flattened, then we acknowledge there are 3 regions there. So it's not being flattened as one image. So each of these fairy regions now emits multiple particle system of these sparkly stars that are being made. And then all of these other effects, actions over here apply to these sparkly stars. So the kill, the size, the velocity, and the gravity all belong to stars, because as we realize, even though the fairies were moving across, those sparkly stars were falling downwards, and that's because of the gravity. So let's take a quick peek inside the second sprite emitter, specifically the advanced section of the generation tab. So I didn't go over this section at all, and it's actually specifically designed for when bakers are entered into the right-hand port of a sprite emitter. So the first option that we have is the mass of the particle, and this defines how the particles interact with each other in terms of the gravity. So the higher it is, the faster they pull down if they're close together. The region size for baked particle input is the spherical region that is created around the original particle, so that would be the fairy, in order to distribute the second particle system. So copy particle velocity for baked particle input. So if we check this, then these particles would take on the velocity of their parent particle system. So add particle age for baked particle input. Once again, this just means that the particle system will take on the age of its parent particle system. Align initial velocity. Once again, it will align its initial velocity with that of its parent particle system. And then here we have 2 extra options for the minimum and maximum initial rotation. So you can enter an amount in degrees for how much a particle can rotate per frame. And so let's go back to the camera view and just take a look at the system one more time. So if we hit the play button, you can see the fairies come in, and we can see these sparkly stars being generated from behind their wings. So that's it for the tutorial, Particle Effect Modules and Templates Part 2. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, Creating a Custom Particle Effect.